Some valleys cradle their silence the way the mountains cradle snow, heavy, hidden, and unwilling to melt. Tom Walker, a soldier-turned-farmer, thought he knew every ridge and hollow of his family's land in Cedar Valley. Yet one mist-laden morning, while following his dog Max up the forgotten slopes, he stumbled upon a fracture in the stone face. Behind tangled roots and weather-worn rock, a narrow opening yawned like a scar in the mountain's skin. Cold air bled out, laced with iron and dust. Inside, not ancient carvings but rusted crates, stenciled with fading military marks, waited in the shadows. Silent witnesses to a secret buried since the days when the world balanced on the knife's edge of war. What Tom uncovered was not history etched in stone, but a hidden truth men had once killed to keep unseen. The morning in Cedar Valley carried a chill that clung to the air like dew to the grass, a quiet veil drawn across the land that had once been alive with the thunder of tractors and the laughter of children. Tom Walker tightened his grip on the steering wheel of the old pickup truck as it rattled down the narrow dirt road leading toward the farmhouse that had been in his family for 3 generations. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the cedar trees, and the scent of damp earth mixed with pine sap filled his lungs as he cracked the window open. He had not driven this road in over 20 years, yet every turn felt carved into his memory like scars in old wood. Tom was a man marked by both time and war. At 45, he bore the rugged frame of someone who had labored under heavy packs and heavier burdens, his shoulders broad, but his posture slightly stooped as if the weight of memory pressed down even when no rucksack was slung across his back. His hair, once a uniform dark brown, was now peppered with strands of gray that caught the morning light, and the neatly trimmed beard along his jaw carried the same mixture of color, a reminder of battles endured and nights without sleep. His eyes, a pale steel blue, rarely rested, flicking between rearview mirror and horizon, a habit born in deserts and jungles where unseen threats had always lurked. He had never been known as a talkative man. Even as a boy, his quiet nature set him apart. But war had carved deeper lines of silence into him, turning his voice into something measured and cautious, reserved for when words truly mattered. In the passenger seat sat Max, his German shepherd, a solid and reassuring presence who had become both guardian and companion since Tom's return from his last deployment. Max was 6 years old, with a sable-gray coat that shimmered under the stray beams of sunlight breaking through the tree line. His ears stood alert, swiveling with every sound of the countryside, his amber eyes sharp yet softened whenever they turned toward Tom. Max had been trained once for work with veterans recovering from trauma, but in Tom he had found not just a partner to serve, but a man to anchor. The dog had a steady, loyal temperament, rarely given to unnecessary noise, though he could erupt with ferocity if a stranger's steps felt wrong. He leaned slightly forward now, nose pressed close to the cracked window, sniffing the familiar but long-absent scents of Cedar Valley, tail thumping faintly against the worn leather seat, as though recognizing a home Tom himself could not yet call his own. The truck groaned as it came to a stop in front of the farmhouse. The structure stood weathered but unyielding, its white paint long since surrendered to the gray of bare wood, shutters askew and porch railings sagging like tired bones. Weeds had claimed the once neat garden, and the barn beyond leaned into the earth as though exhausted by decades of storms. Tom sat still for a moment, gripping the wheel, staring at the house that had shaped his boyhood and, in many ways, his silence. Coming back should have felt like peace, but instead a tightness coiled in his chest, as if the house itself judged him for staying away so long. He remembered his father's voice, a stern man who spoke rarely but carried the weight of command in every sentence, echoing in the wood beams, teaching him that land was both burden and blessing. His father had died while Tom was stationed overseas, and Tom had not been there to bury him. That absence gnawed at him now, an unhealed wound as raw as the memories of firefights and fallen comrades. Max barked softly, breaking his reverie, a single sharp note that drew Tom back into the present. It was as if the dog was telling him, "You're home. Get out." With a sigh that felt like surrender, Tom opened the door, boots hitting the gravel with a thud. He stretched his stiff legs and took in the valley around him. Cedar Valley stretched out quiet and green, framed by ridges that blued into the distance. A hawk wheeled overhead, its cry slicing the air. Somewhere far off, a chainsaw buzzed, reminding him that life had continued here without him. He wondered if he had the right to lay claim to this place again, or if he was merely an intruder in his own inheritance. The farmhouse door creaked open slowly, not by his hand, but by the weight of memory. Inside, the room smelled of dust and disuse, the furniture draped in sheets like shrouds. Tom wandered through the dim hallway, boots stirring the silence, Max padding beside him with ears pricked. On the mantel above the cold fireplace, photographs leaned askew. His father in a World War II uniform, his mother in her Sunday dress, a boyish Tom grinning with a fishing pole. He stared at the images as though they belonged to strangers, a family that had existed in another lifetime. He pressed a hand against the rough wood of the mantel, feeling the grain under his palm, grounding himself in something solid, something that had endured even as he had been scattered by the winds of service. The silence of the house weighed heavily, broken only by the soft pant of Max and the groan of floorboards under Tom's boots. He knew he would need supplies soon, and that meant facing the town, facing people who remembered him as a boy, who would now see him as something else entirely, a soldier aged before his time, carrying shadows in his gaze. He dreaded their pity, their questions, their curiosity. Yet he also knew Cedar Valley was not a place where secrets stayed hidden long, and the moment he stepped into Mary Evans's general store, the quiet gossip that tied the valley together would begin weaving around him again. He could almost hear Mary's voice already, warm but edged with curiosity, her laughter carrying through the aisles as she kept her little ledger of debts and favors. But for now, he stayed on the porch as the morning light rose higher, warming the valley and driving mist into the trees. He lowered himself onto the steps, Max settling at his side with a sigh, the dog's body pressed against his knee. Tom watched the land breathe, the cedars swaying in a breeze that smelled faintly of rain. He thought of the nights ahead, the scenes he both longed for and feared. Perhaps he had come back to heal, or perhaps to bury himself in work so he might not hear the echoes of war. Either way, the land would test him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes distant. Somewhere deep in the mountains beyond, secrets waited, though he did not yet know it. For now, there was only the weight of return, the quiet companionship of Max, and the uneasy peace of a man standing on the threshold between his past and his uncertain future. The fog of early morning hung low over Cedar Valley, a pale silver veil that muted the edges of the land. Tom Walker adjusted the strap of his old canvas jacket and followed the tug of Max's leash as the dog pulled him away from the farmhouse and toward the ridge that shadowed the eastern boundary of the property. Max's nose was to the ground, tail rigid, the German shepherd's 6-year-old body tense with purpose. Tom trusted the instincts of his companion. Over the years, he had learned that the dog's senses often caught what his own weary eyes overlooked. The climb was steep, the soil damp from night mist, roots jutting out like crooked arms, ready to snag the boots of the unsteady. Tom moved with careful precision, his broad frame built for endurance rather than speed, each step deliberate. His breath steamed in the chill air, and memories of long patrols through hostile terrain pressed unbidden into his mind. Jungles heavy with heat, deserts shimmering with mirages, places where every step could conceal danger. He shook the thought away, focusing on Max's steady movement. They reached a slope where cedar trees grew so close their branches knotted together, shutting out much of the dawn. The ground here felt rarely touched, a wilderness within land technically his, but left untended since his father's time. Max slowed, ears pricked, then padded to a moss-covered wall of stone. The dog sniffed hard, pawing at the damp green surface. Tom crouched, running his calloused hands across the moss until his fingers found a crevice. When he pressed, a chunk of loosened rock shifted, revealing a narrow fissure in the mountainside. Cold air drifted out, heavy with the smell of iron and forgotten places. Tom eased aside more of the moss and stone until the fissure widened enough to peer inside. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on shapes that made him frown. Crates stacked clumsily, their metal bands rusted, wood swollen from decades of moisture. He stepped in carefully, Max at his heels. The cave floor was uneven, damp, echoing faint drips from deeper chambers. Tom brushed dirt from one crate. Faded stenciling emerged, block letters spelling out U.S. property, with numbers he recognized as surplus codes. He pried open the lid with effort, hinges groaning like bones long disused. Inside lay corroded ration tins, a disassembled radio, and a bundle of canvas tarps folded tight. Time had eaten at everything, yet there was no mistaking the military origin. Tom's stomach tightened. Why would Cold War supplies be hidden here on land his family had farmed for generations? It wasn't ordinary storage. These crates weren't logged in any records he knew. He had handled enough supply lines during his service to know the difference between sanctioned storage and shadow operations. As he stood among the relics, Max gave a sharp bark that echoed off the cave walls. Tom swung the flashlight, heart hammering, but found nothing. Only deeper shadow. The dog sniffed toward a side tunnel partly blocked by fallen stone. Tom knelt, brushed aside rubble, and felt the unmistakable edges of more crates buried beneath. His breath caught. Whoever had placed them here had wanted them hidden beyond accidental discovery. The sound of snapping twigs outside made him freeze. He doused the flashlight, crouching instinctively, combat reflexes firing after years of being hunted by silence. A figure appeared at the cave entrance, silhouetted against the mist. It was an older man, tall but stooped, with broad shoulders softened by age. His face came into view, deep creases carved from sun and time, gray hair thinning under a sweat-stained hat. This was Mr. Brown, his nearest neighbor. Mr. Brown had lived in Cedar Valley for over 70 years, the last of a family of ranchers who once owned sprawling acres before selling most to pay debts. Known around town as reserved, he rarely spoke more than necessary, his weathered hands more comfortable on tools than in greetings, yet his eyes, dark and penetrating, carried the weight of secrets. He had lost a brother decades ago under circumstances the family never discussed, and the shadow of that absence clung to him, shaping his withdrawn nature. "Tom," Mr. Brown said, his voice gravelly, echoing faintly in the cave mouth, "didn't expect to see you up this way." His gaze shifted briefly to Max, then past him into the shadows of the cave. For a fraction of a second his expression tightened, as if he recognized something and wished he hadn't. Tom straightened slowly, brushing dirt from his jacket. "Dog caught a scent. Thought I'd check it out." Mr. Brown stepped closer, his boots crunching on loose stone. Up close, his face seemed even more etched by the years, his jaw shadowed by stubble he hadn't bothered to shave, lips pressed thin. He peered at the crates without moving too far inside, then cleared his throat. "Old place. Folks used to say the mountain kept things best left alone." There was a warning in his tone, though softly spoken. Max let out a low growl, body tensed at Tom's side. Tom rested a steadying hand on the dog's back, but kept his eyes on Mr. Brown. "You ever see anything like this before?" Tom asked, keeping his voice level. Mr. Brown's gaze lingered on the rusted crates, then slid away. "Best to let the past lie, Walker. Digging too deep never did a man good. He adjusted his hat and stepped back into the mist, his outline fading until only the sound of his retreating steps remained. Tom stood motionless long after, the echo of those words gnawing at him. His instinct screamed that Brown knew more than he let on, that the old man's silence was not ignorance, but deliberate choice. The crates at his feet, the chill of the cave, and Max's restless pacing combined into a sense of something unsettled, something that tied this valley's quiet surface to buried truths. Replaced the lid on the crate, wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold air, and led Max out into the mist. Standing on the slope, he looked back at the concealed entrance. From the outside, it vanished again into cedar and moss, as though the earth itself conspired to keep its secrets. But Tom's mind churned with questions he could not yet answer. Whatever this place was, it was not just forgotten military waste. It was a message from the past, sealed in wood and rust, waiting for someone stubborn enough or reckless enough to listen. The sky above Cedar Valley was pale blue by mid-morning. The fog burned away, leaving the mountain ridges sharp against the horizon. Tom Walker returned to the cave with Max close at his side, carrying a crowbar, a flashlight, and a determination that had only grown stronger after his unsettling encounter with Mr. Brown. The German shepherd's thick gray and black fur shone faintly in the light. His ears perked, every muscle alert, as though he, too, sensed the weight of what they were about to uncover. Inside, the air was cold and stale, carrying the metallic tang of rust. Tom went straight for the crate he had noticed half buried beneath fallen stones. He wedged the crowbar under the swollen lid, muscles straining until the wood splintered with a sharp crack. Dust plumed into the beam of his flashlight. Within lay objects that spoke of another era, a military-issue radio set, its knobs stiff and cracked with age, canvas satchels with faded U.S. markings, and on top a leather tube sealed with a corroded brass clasp. Tom's pulse quickened. He pulled the tube free, brushed away grime, and opened it. Inside was a rolled sheet of heavy paper. Spreading it on the ground, he discovered a hand-drawn map, edges yellowed, the ink still bold in places. It depicted the valley and surrounding mountains, but not as he knew them. A series of dotted lines traced winding routes through ridges and forests, connecting symbols that looked like crude boxes. One symbol was drawn exactly where he stood now, marked with a small star. Another line stretched north, ending near the high ridges that bordered government land. He leaned closer, his sharp gray-blue eyes narrowing, reading annotations scrawled in quick handwriting. Transit Point Bravo, safe cache. Contact signal, RF 117.9. His mind returned instantly to his years in uniform. These weren't the markings of treasure hunters or careless ranchers. This was logistics, secret supply movement, likely from the Cold War, and it hadn't been meant for discovery. Max pawed at the radio set, whining softly. Tom tested the weight of the machine. It was heavy, solid, its casing dented but intact. He found a compartment inside with spare parts, wires, even a small instruction card laminated in plastic. Someone had left it here, ready for use, though decades had passed since. He felt an odd chill. The crunch of footsteps startled him. He snapped off the flashlight, instinct pulling him to the shadows. A beam of light swept across the cave mouth. "Tom, you in there?" The voice was female, warm but steady. A moment later, a figure stepped inside. She was tall, around 5'9", her frame lean but strong. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose braid, and her freckled skin was weathered by years of work outdoors. Her green eyes reflected both intelligence and caution. This was Sarah Mitchell, who ran the only supply store in town. Sarah had inherited the store after her husband's fatal accident at a Biaoshad logging site 5 years earlier. Left to raise 2 children alone, she had hardened in spirit but retained a core of kindness. She was known for giving credit to families in trouble, even when she couldn't afford it herself, but she carried herself with the wary air of someone who had learned not to trust promises too easily. Tom straightened, brushing dirt from his knees. "Sarah, what brings you up here?" She frowned at the sight of the crates, then at the map spread across the stone floor. Old Mr. Brown came by the store. He looked rattled. "Said you'd found something you ought to leave alone. Figured I'd better see for myself before gossip runs wild." Her gaze dropped to the map again, and a crease formed between her brows. "That's not rancher's work. Looks like military." Tom studied her reaction. "You've seen something like this before?" Sarah hesitated, chewing her lower lip, then crouched beside him. "Not this exact thing, but when I was a kid, my father used to talk about shipments moving through these mountains. He was with the Forest Service, always patrolling the back ridges. Said sometimes he saw trucks where no road should be. He told me once never to wander near the old cedar groves because that's where men with clipped hair and stiff collars pass through. I thought he was just scaring me." Her voice caught for a moment, the memory of her father softening her tone. He had died young, from a heart attack in his 40s, leaving her to grow up quickly. That early loss had carved resilience into her, but it had also left her suspicious of secrets, especially those hidden by authority. Tom rolled the map carefully and placed it back in the tube. "Then maybe your father knew more than most. This isn't just history. Someone set this place up as a transit point. And Mr. Brown, he seemed too eager for me to walk away." Max barked sharply, facing the dark side tunnel. The sound echoed, making Sarah flinch. "You think this is still active?" she asked, lowering her voice. Tom shook his head slowly. "Not active, but someone's been keeping this buried. That alone tells me there's more to it." Sarah straightened, brushing dirt from her jeans. "You should be careful. Folks around here don't like questions. Some of them have lived too long with things they'd rather forget. And if Brown warned you off, you can bet others will too." Her words carried weight, and Tom respected that. He packed the map and radio into his backpack, his decision already made. Whatever secrets lay between these ridges, he intended to follow the trail until he knew the truth. When they stepped outside, the valley lay wide and bright, sunlight pouring across fields where elk grazed and the creek shimmered like glass. Yet Tom felt none of its peace. He saw only the dotted lines of the map in his mind, the unfinished trail through mountains that seemed suddenly less like home and more like a labyrinth. The afternoon sun slanted across Cedar Valley, casting long shadows from the cedar trees that lined the edge of Tom Walker's property. He leaned against the fence rail, Max sitting alert by his boots, the dog's sable-gray fur glowing in the light. The radio and map he had found still weighed heavy in his mind. Sarah's warning lingered as well, but it was the image of Mr. Brown's face in the cave that unsettled him most. The man had seen something and chosen Solomines. Tom had dealt with men like that before, soldiers who carried truths too heavy to speak. And now he meant to test just how much the old rancher knew. Later that evening, Tom walked the gravel road, hors d'oeuvre, that cut between his land and Brown's. The farmhouse ahead stood squat and weather-beaten, paint peeling, roof patched with tin sheets. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney, though the air was still mild for autumn. Mr. Brown was bent over a trough near the barn, his broad back hunched, wiry muscles moving under a faded work shirt. He straightened when he heard the crunch of Tom's boots. Brown's face was a map of deep creases, sunburnt skin stretched over strong bones. His dark eyes were sharp, though dulled by years of guarding thoughts rather than speaking them. A gray beard shadowed his jawline, trimmed unevenly, giving him the look of a man who cared little for appearances. He wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze narrowing as Tom approached, with Max trotting beside him. "Walker," Brown said, his voice gravelly, a note of suspicion threading through it. "Didn't expect visitors." "Just thought I'd stop by," Tom replied evenly. "Your words the other day, they stuck, about letting the past lie." Brown squinted, his eyes drifting toward Max, who sat stiffly, tail twitching, emitting a low growl as the man stepped closer. Brown raised a hand, not in fear, but in a slow, calming gesture, as though he had handled enough animals to know respect was safer than challenge. "I've seen that look in a dog," Brown muttered, his gaze never leaving Max. "Knows when something's not right." Then he turned back to Tom. "What is it you're after?" Tom folded his arms across his chest, his canvas jacket creasing. "I found a map. Shows a route through the eastern ridge, marked with symbols I don't think were meant for ranching. You ever hear about anything like that?" For a brief second, something flickered across Brown's weathered face. An involuntary tightening of the jaw, a glance that darted east before he caught himself. Then he chuckled, though it rang hollow. "Maps, roots. This land's full of hunters, prospectors, kids with too much time scratching on paper. You shouldn't go reading ghosts into old ink." Tom watched him carefully. "This wasn't a kid's sketch, it came with equipment. Cold War vintage. You and I both know that means somebody stashed it there for a reason." Brown shifted his weight, boots scraping gravel. "Weather's turning early this year. You'll want to get your fences mended before the storms roll in." He moved toward his gate, clearly intending to close the conversation. Max's growl deepened as Brown passed, his hackles raised. Tom laid a hand on the dog's back, but didn't take his eyes off the older man. "You don't want me asking questions," Tom said, his voice low. "That tells me I'm asking the right ones." Brown stopped at his gate, hand resting on the latch. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he seemed smaller, swallowed by years and secrets. He looked back, and there was something almost pleading in his eyes, buried beneath the hard lines. "Walker, some things were buried for a reason. Dig them up, and you'll wish you hadn't." Then he disappeared inside, the door closing with a thud that echoed louder than it should have. Tom stood in the twilight, Max pressing close to his leg. The silence of the valley stretched around them, but inside, Tom's thoughts thundered. Brown's evasion wasn't ignorance. It was fear. And fear meant truth was close, close enough to threaten. As they walked back to their own farm, the wind picked up through the cedars, carrying the scent of rain. Tom glanced toward the eastern ridge, where the dotted lines of the map ran in his mind. He knew now he wasn't chasing rust and relics. He was chasing something others had guarded fiercely, perhaps for generations. And Mr. Brown's silence was as much an answer as words. The morning after his tense exchange with Mr. Brown, Tom Walker returned to the mountain cave with Max at his side. The dog moved with restless energy, nose pressed to the ground as though the earth itself whispered secrets to him. The air inside was colder today, sharper, carrying the scent of damp stone. Tom's flashlight swept across the rusted crates, but Max ignored them, instead circling to a corner of the cavern where rocks had collapsed long ago. He pawed furiously, claws striking stone with a scraping echo. Tom crouched and pressed his shoulder against the loose rock. With effort, he dislodged a wedge-shaped slab, revealing a hollow space beneath. His pulse quickened. Clearing more rubble, he exposed a narrow shaft descending into darkness. He lowered himself in carefully, boots scraping the sides, until he dropped into a smaller chamber. Max followed, slipping down with feline agility for a dog of his size. The beam of light revealed a single metal container, rectangular, edges reinforced, its surface coated with oil that had preserved it against time. Tom brushed the grime away and saw a military issue clasp still intact. He pried it open, hinges groaning, and inside found bundles of files wrapped in waxed paper. He peeled one open, his breath catching as he read the typed headings. Personnel file, classified, missing in action. The names were unfamiliar until his eyes froze on one. Private Samuel R. Hale. His father's comrade, the man Tom had grown up hearing about in hushed tones. According to official record, Hale had vanished on a training mission somewhere outside the valley. His father had never believed the official explanation, though he rarely spoke of it. To see Hale's file here, buried in this hidden chamber, made Tom's blood run cold. He flipped through pages brittle with age, duty rosters, report stamped confidential, a grainy photograph of a young soldier with sharp cheekbones, buzz-cut hair, and a grin that belied the seriousness of the uniform he wore. Hale's eyes, bright, ambitious, trusting, seemed to accuse Tom from across decades. Notes at the margin described him as transferred to restricted operations. But a later page stamped in red simply read, Status eliminated. Tom's hands trembled as he lowered the file. He remembered nights as a boy when his father sat silent on the porch, staring at the horizon with a drink untouched in his hand. He remembered once, after a thunderstorm, finding his father's face, wet not from rain, but from tears. Now he understood. His father had carried the suspicion that his friend was not lost to battle or accident, but erased deliberately. Max pressed close, head against Tom's knee, sensing the turmoil. Tom exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. If Hale's file was here, what else lay buried in these records? He opened more bundles, scanning names of other soldiers. Most he did not know, but all listed as missing in or around Cedar Valley during the 1960s and 1970s. Each dossier ended in the same cryptic summary: removed from active list. As he gathered the files, a sound above startled him: boots scuffing on stone. He snapped off his light, clutching Max's collar. A shadow crossed the entrance of the chamber, and then a figure climbed down slowly. It was a woman, slender, dressed in a forest green jacket and dark jeans, hair pulled into a neat ponytail. Her skin was pale, her expression set in determination. She carried a notepad in one hand, a small recorder clipped to her belt. "Tom Walker," she said softly, voice even but firm. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. I believe you have something that needs to be seen." Tom blinked in surprise. He had met Sarah briefly at the cave days ago, but here her role was different. Now she was not just the storekeeper, but something more deliberate. She set her bag down, producing a press badge, long faded, but still legible. "I worked as a reporter in Denver before I came back here," Sarah explained. "After my husband's accident, I returned to Cedar Valley to raise my kids, but I never stopped following stories. And this," she gestured toward the files in Tom's hands, "this is bigger than anything this town has admitted to." Tom studied her closely. She was tall, nearly his height, with a wiry frame built from years of physical work. Her auburn hair caught the beam of his flashlight, revealing streaks of sun-faded copper. Her green eyes glinted sharp as glass. Freckles dotted her nose and cheeks, lending a softness that contrasted with the hard set of her jaw. She was a woman forged by loss, her husband crushed beneath a logging truck, her years since marked by struggle and quiet resilience. That loss had made her skeptical of institutions, unwilling to accept easy explanations. Tom narrowed his gaze. "And how exactly did you know I'd be here?" Sarah smirked faintly. "Mr. Brown came to the store again. He was nervous, muttered something about you digging too deep. I guessed you wouldn't let it go. Men like you rarely do." Tom considered denying it, but Max's quiet growl reminded him there was no use in half-truths now. He showed her the file of Samuel Hale. She read silently, lips pressing together until the color drained from her face. "This isn't just history," Sarah murmured. "This is evidence. Somebody wanted these men to disappear off paper, and they used Cedar Valley as their graveyard." Tom closed the container with a firm snap. Then the question is why? And who else knows? They climbed out together, Max leading the way. Outside, the sky had clouded over, the scent of approaching rain thick in the air. Tom hefted the container over his shoulder, the weight far heavier than its steel and paper. Sarah walked beside him, her stride purposeful, her eyes darting to the ridges as though half expecting watchers in the trees. As they descended toward the farm, Tom knew one thing with certainty. The truth buried in that chamber was not a relic of the past. It was a secret that still pulsed like a wound, and exposing it might draw dangers as present as any he had faced in war. Rain had fallen through the night, leaving Cedar Valley washed in a sheen of silver. The earth was soft beneath Tom Walker's boots as he returned once more to the cave, Max bounding ahead, his thick sable-gray coat dampened by mist. Sarah Mitchell followed close behind, the auburn braid trailing down her back darkened by moisture, her green eyes sharp with alertness. She carried a canvas satchel slung across her shoulder, the outline of a recorder and notepad visible beneath the flap. The cave mouth exhaled its usual cold breath as they stepped inside, the smell of wet stone and rust thick in the air. Tom carried the sealed metal box they had pried open the day before, his jaw tight, his steel blue eyes weary but intent. They set their equipment down, Sarah kneeling on the ground, spreading a tarp to protect the fragile files. Tom unfolded the map once more, its yellowed edges curling toward the damp air, and placed it beside the records. Max sniffed along the stone wall, his nails scraping softly. Suddenly he stopped, ears pricked, and began to scratch at a crevice between rocks. His growl rumbled low as if he sensed something trapped. Tom moved quickly, pulling his knife from its sheath, prying loose the stone. Something small and metallic fell into his hand. A dog tag, the surface pitted and rough with rust, dangled from a fragment of chain. The letters were faint but legible. Hale, Samuel R. Tom's chest tightened, memories of his father's stories pressing hard against him. He rubbed his thumb over the letters, the rust smearing red-brown across his skin like dried blood. Sarah leaned in, eyes widening. It's him. Proof he was here. They didn't just file him away, they brought him here. Tom stared at the tag, silent for a long moment. In his mind, images of his father sitting on the porch at night, staring into the dark, rose with painful clarity. All those years, the suspicion unspoken, and here rust and metal confirmed it. They laid the tag beside the files. Sarah opened one dossier after another, matching names to dates, locations, and notations scribbled in the margins. Together, they began to see a pattern. Tom traced the map with a calloused finger, aligning each cache point with a missing soldier's file. Each line ended at a notation. Removed. Sarah sat back on her heels, freckles stark against her pale skin under the harsh beam of the flashlight. This wasn't an accident. This was a system. They used these mountains to make people disappear. Her voice trembled with restrained fury. Tom's expression hardened. Not just soldiers gone missing in action. These were men silenced. Maybe they were deserters. Maybe they saw something, but someone decided their truth wasn't worth keeping alive. Sarah clenched her hands into fists. And the town, Mr. Brown, maybe others, they've lived next to this for decades. No wonder he's afraid. He probably lost someone, too. As if in answer, thunder rolled distantly across the ridges. The cave seemed to contract around them, walls heavy with the weight of hidden decades. Sarah pulled a cigarette from a crumpled pack, lit it with shaking fingers, and exhaled smoke into the damp air. You realize, Tom, this could still be dangerous. If these files exist, someone, somewhere, knows they were hidden. And if we start digging too loudly, they'll notice. Tom looked at her, his lined face grim. "I've spent a lifetime facing enemies who hid in the dark. If they're still watching this valley, they'll have to step into the light." Max whined softly, pawing at the map, his nails tapping near a ridge marked with another star. Sarah bent forward, reading the faded notation. "Transit Point Echo. If these other places match the files, maybe that's where we find more proof." Tom rolled the map carefully, sliding it back into the tube. His mind spun with the realization. The cave wasn't just a cache. It was a node in a web. Cedar Valley was the center of a network designed to erase men from existence. His father's silence, Mr. Brown's fear, Sarah's half-remembered warnings from her father. They all fit now, puzzle pieces locked together into a picture of betrayal. As they emerged into the rain-soaked valley, Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her tall frame, cigarette still burning between her fingers. She looked over her shoulder at the cave mouth, her green eyes haunted. Some secrets rot underground until they poison everything above. If we expose this, the whole valley's going to choke on the truth. Tom glanced at Max, the dog standing steady by his side, the tag of Samuel Hale still clenched in his hand. "Then let it choke," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. No more shadows. The morning broke clear over Cedar Valley, the storm of the previous night leaving the land scrubbed clean and raw. Mist curled like ribbons over the cedars, the creek below ran high and fast, and the sky stretched blue and merciless above. Tom Walker stood on the porch of the farmhouse, map tube and sealed files spread on the table before him. His steel blue eyes were drawn and sleepless, his jaw rough with stubble that caught the light. He had not slept because choice had kept him awake, to remain silent and fold the truth back into the earth, or to bring it out into the open and let whatever storm followed break over him. Max padded over, the German shepherd's fur still damp from dew, his amber eyes steady as if he could read his master's turmoil. Tom laid a hand on the dog's head, fingers brushing over the familiar ridge of his skull. He whispered softly, "They wanted silence, but you and I, we know silence eats men alive." By late morning, Tom had driven his old truck into town, Max in the passenger seat, head out the window. His destination was the general store, where Sarah Mitchell had agreed to meet. Sarah was already there, tall and lean, auburn hair tied back, freckles stark under the sunlight. She wore a faded leather jacket and jeans, a cigarette burning between her fingers as she leaned against the wall. She stubbed it out when Tom parked, stepping forward with the quick, efficient gait of someone accustomed to carrying weight without complaint. "Decide?" she asked, green eyes locking onto him. Tom nodded, lifting the metal box onto the truck's hood. "We take it to someone who can't be bought, someone who knows what to do with it." Sarah exhaled slowly, tension easing from her shoulders. "There's a man I know. Dr. Harold Whitaker, retired military historian. Used to teach at the university in Denver until he started digging into records people didn't want him to touch. They called him a conspiracy theorist, but he's the one they couldn't silence with bribes or tenure threats. He works freelance now, independent. If anyone can put these files into the right hands, it's him." Later that day, they met Whitaker in a quiet diner on the edge of town. The man who entered was in his late 60s, tall but slightly stooped, with a frame that hinted at athleticism long past. His hair was iron gray, brushed back neatly, and his face was sharply angular, the jaw lined with a trimmed beard streaked white. He wore a tweed jacket despite the warm day, spectacles perched low on his nose, and carried himself with the weary dignity of a man who had been dismissed one too many times. His eyes, however, were piercing, a pale hazel that seemed to miss nothing. He shook Tom's hand firmly, his grip belying his age, then slid into the booth. "Sarah tells me you've found something unusual." His voice was cultured but edged, the tone of a lecturer who had lost patience with evasions. Tom placed the dog, tag, and the first dossier on the table. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and began to read. As the pages turned, the older man's expression darkened. He traced his finger along the red stamp of removed from active list, lips pressed into a hard line. When he finished, he set the file down with care, as though it were a relic from a battlefield. "This," Whitaker said quietly, "is confirmation of a program I've suspected for years. Off-the-books elimination of personnel deemed compromised. They called it Operation Ashfall, though officially it doesn't exist. These mountains were a convenient cover. Isolated, loyal locals, military contracts disguised as land management. But to see Hale's name," he shook his head, his voice catching. "That means the paper trails I found weren't speculation. They were murder cloaked as procedure." Sarah leaned forward, her green eyes blazing. "So what do we do? The valley's lived with these shadows for decades. People like Mr. Brown, they've been carrying the silence. This could burn the whole place down." Whitaker looked from Sarah to Tom, then to Max lying by the booth, head resting on his paws. "The only way shadows die is under light. We document everything. We duplicate. And we deliver it to outlets that can't be silenced, not one, but many. Once this truth is out, no one can bury it again." Tom's gaze dropped to the dog tag of Samuel Hale. He thought of his father, of long nights haunted by unspoken grief. He clenched his jaw. "Then we do it. For them." Over the next days, Tom and Sarah worked tirelessly under Whitaker's guidance. They photocopied every file, photographed every page, and stored backups on encrypted drives Whitaker provided. Sarah recorded testimony, her voice steady as she read aloud the names of the missing. Tom spoke as well, though his words were sparse, his voice carrying the weight of conviction rather than eloquence. At dusk, Tom drove up the hill to the cemetery that overlooked Cedar Valley. The air was cool, the grass wet underfoot. He stopped before his father's grave, the headstone weathered but strong. Max sat at his side, tail sweeping the ground in slow, steady rhythm. Tom laid Samuel Hale's rusted dog tag on the stone, his rough fingers lingering on the cold metal. "Dad," he whispered, his voice low but unshaken. "I'm giving them back their voices. No more silence. No more shadows." The wind carried his words across the valley, through the cedars and into the mountains where the secrets had lain buried. Max's tail wagged once more, and the dog pressed his head against Tom's leg, a quiet affirmation that the path chosen was the right one. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not written in thunder or lightning, but in the quiet uncovering of truth. Just as Tom chose the light over silence, we too are reminded that God calls us to stand for justice, even when the cost is heavy. In our everyday lives, truth may not hide in mountain caves, but it waits in small choices: how we treat our family, how we forgive, how we speak when silence feels easier. May this story remind us that God's hand is always guiding, that no secret is too dark for His light, and no burden too heavy for His mercy. And may He bless you, dear listener, as you walk your own path of courage and compassion. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel so these tales of hope and truth may continue. May the Lord watch over you and your loved ones, today and always.